I drove 6 hours through a February whiteout on the Trans-Canada to get back to Sudbury for my grandmother's birthday. My shift at the hospital in Thunder Bay had ended at 7 in the morning, and I hadn't slept, but I didn't care. I had a carrot cake from her favorite bakery in the back seat, a card signed by half the nurses on my ward, and 3 days off I'd been saving since November. What I didn't have was any idea that when I turned onto her street, I would find the driveway empty, the house dark, and my grandmother sitting alone in her kitchen in a housecoat, shaking so hard she couldn't hold her mug. The thermostat read 14 degrees in February in northern Ontario. On the counter, held down by the sugar bowl, was a note in my uncle's handwriting. Gone to Whistler for the week. She's fine. Don't make it a thing. My grandmother, 78 years old, recovering from a hip replacement she'd had 6 weeks earlier, couldn't walk to the bathroom without a cane. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning because no one had left her anything she could reach from a seated position. Her medication, the blood thinners she needed twice a day, was in a cabinet above the stove. They had left her there, gone to Whistler, for a ski trip. Booked, I would later find out, on her credit card. I want to be honest with you. When I walked through that door and saw her sitting there, the first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was something quieter and worse. It was the recognition that this had probably happened before, that this wasn't a lapse. This was a pattern, and I had been too far away, too busy telling myself my uncle and his wife were handling things to see it clearly. But I want you to know something else. Before my grandmother fell asleep that night in clean sheets with a full stomach and her medications taken on time, she told me something that changed everything. She looked at me from the pillow and said, quietly, that she needed to tell me about the account, the one she'd never told anyone else about. Comment, justice if you believe people who exploit the elderly always get what's coming to them. Because what happened next, they never saw it coming. I'm 31 years old. I've been a registered nurse for 7 years, the last 3 of them in the ICU at a hospital 5 hours from where I grew up. My grandmother basically raised me. My parents divorced when I was 9, and for 3 years while my mother found her footing and my father moved to Calgary and started a second family, it was my grandmother's house on Howie Street in Sudbury that was the constant. She taught me to make cabbage rolls. She drove me to volleyball practice. She was the one sitting in the front row at my nursing graduation, not because she had to be, but because she wanted to be. Because that's who she was. Her name is Loretta. She is 78 years old, and she is the sharpest person I have ever met. I need you to understand that before I tell you everything that followed, because what follows is going to sound extreme to some people. And I need you to understand that Loretta herself asked for every single piece of it. The drive up had been brutal. A system had come in off Lake Superior around Wawa and turned the highway into a moving wall of white. I white-knuckled it through 3 hours of blowing snow, stopping once at a Tim Hortons in Chapleau to drink bad coffee and stare at the road reports on my phone. I promised her I'd be there for dinner. It was going to be close. I had the carrot cake. I had a good Riesling from a winery she liked near Niagara. I had plans to take her to her favorite Ukrainian place on Elm Street the next morning, the one where the owner still calls her by the French nickname she had in her 20s. When I turned onto Howie Street, the houses were lit up the way they always are in February, all that yellow warmth spilling out onto the snow. Except hers. Hers was dark except for the kitchen light. I told myself she'd fallen asleep early. I told myself she was probably watching TV in the bedroom. I had a key. I let myself in. The cold hit me before anything else. That specific cold of a house that's been on minimum heat for too long. Not emergency cold, but wrong cold. The kind that takes a day or two to settle in. I could see my breath in the hallway. Mamie? I called out. That's what I'd always called her. It's the French word, the one her own grandmother used. In the kitchen, Chérie. She was sitting at the table in her winter housecoat and 2 pairs of socks, both hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Her cane was hooked over the chair beside her. She looked up when I came in and the expression on her face did something to me. I am still not entirely able to describe. It was relief, yes, but underneath it was something older and more ashamed, the look of someone who has been waiting longer than they want to admit and who had stopped expecting to be collected. "How long has it been like this in here?" I asked. "Since Tuesday." It was Friday. I didn't say anything. I turned up the thermostat, went back to the car for the cake and the wine, came back in and started opening cupboards. There was a can of tomato soup and a box of crackers she'd been working through. The fruit bowl had 2 soft pears and an orange that had dried out completely. In the fridge, a partial block of old cheddar and 3/4 of a carton of milk. I made her scrambled eggs and toast. I reheated the soup. I sat across from her and watched her eat with the focused, careful hunger of someone who hasn't had a real meal in longer than they want to say. After dinner, I checked her medications. The blood thinners were in the upper cabinet, the one she'd told her doctor she couldn't reach without help since the surgery. She hadn't missed a dose, I found out. She'd been pulling herself up on the counter edge and reaching for them that way. Her surgeon would not have been pleased. I found the note while I was washing up, held down by the sugar bowl where they'd put it so she'd see it when she came for her morning tea. "Gone to Whistler for the week with Janet and the kids. Loretta is good. Don't make it a thing. Doug." Doug is my uncle, my mother's younger brother. He moved in with my grandmother 4 years ago when his marriage ended, told her it was temporary, and had been there ever since. He didn't pay rent. He used her second car. He'd been added to her checking account in case of emergency. Janet was the woman he'd been seeing for 2 years, a fact my grandmother had told me about in the apologetic tone she used when she was protecting someone who didn't deserve it. I read the note twice. Don't make it a thing. A 78-year-old woman, 6 weeks post-hip surgery, alone in a 14-degree house for 3 days is, in fact, a thing. I set the note next to the sink, took a breath, and went to sit with her. I found her in the living room in her chair, the good one by the window, the one that had been my grandfather's. She'd turned on the lamp and was looking out at the street. The snow had started again, soft and steady. "I should call Doug," I said. "Don't." She said it quickly, then softer. "Not yet. Sit with me a minute." So I sat. We were quiet for a while. The radiator ticked. The snow fell. "You know what I noticed," she said eventually, "when they were packing the car." I waited. "He packed her skis. He packed her children's skis. He packed 4 suitcases and a cooler." She paused. "He didn't leave me a number for the pharmacy. He didn't put the soup on a lower shelf. He didn't show Janet where my medications were in case." She wasn't saying this to make me angry. She was saying it the way you say a thing you've been turning over alone for 3 days, out loud for the first time, to see if it's as bad as it sounds. It was. "He used my Aeroplan points for the flights," she added. "I noticed when the email came. He didn't ask." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Mamie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She turned from the window. "Has this happened before?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded once, small. "How many times?" "This is the 3rd time he's been away since November." She folded her hands in her lap. "The other times Janet came and checked on me. This time she came on the trip." I thought about the months between November and now. I thought about the phone calls where she'd said everything was fine, her voice perfectly ordinary, and I believed it because I needed to. "Mamie," I said, "I want to help you, but I need to know everything." And then she told me about the account. My grandfather had been a mining engineer. He'd worked at Inco for 30 years, retired with a good pension, and invested carefully and quietly for the last 2 decades of his life. When he died 9 years ago, he left my grandmother not just the house but a portfolio, mutual funds, GICs, a rental property in New Sudbury he'd bought in 1987 for $60,000, and that was now worth 8 times that. Doug knew about some of it. He knew about the checking account and the pension deposits. He didn't know about the investment account at the credit union, the one she'd set up under her own name only before she and my grandfather married, and which she had never mentioned to anyone in the family. "Papa suggested it," she said, "when we were first married. He said a woman should always have something that's hers." something that doesn't disappear if things go wrong. The balance, as of last quarter, was just over $400,000. Doug thinks I'm house poor, she said, and there was a small cold smile at the corner of her mouth. I let him think that. I stared at her. He's been asking me to put him on the account, the main one. Said it would make things easier when… She stopped. When I'm gone. He checks the mail before I see it. Last fall he asked me to sign something from his financial advisor. I told him I'd think about it. She reached into the pocket of her housecoat and produced a folded envelope. This came last week. He doesn't know I found it. It was a letter from a law firm in Toronto. A preliminary consultation summary regarding the establishment of a power of attorney for property, with Doug named as attorney. It was addressed to him. It had been opened and resealed, badly. He'd been building toward this for 4 years. Mimi, I said, I'm a mandatory reporter. What I saw in this house tonight, the temperature, the medications, the food situation, I have to report this. I know, she said. And you have the right to change your will. To change who has access to anything, to protect yourself. I know that too. She looked at me steadily. That's why I told you about the account. I've been waiting for the right person to tell. I slept on the couch that night, not because she asked me to, because I wasn't ready to leave the room. The next morning, I made us coffee and called my manager in Thunder Bay to tell her I needed my 3 days plus possibly 2 more. She didn't hesitate. She'd met my grandmother once at a staff event and had taken an immediate liking to her. Take what you need, she said. Then I called my grandmother's family lawyer. His name was Mr. Okafor. She'd used him for 20 years for everything from the rental property to her will. He picked up on the second ring, and when I explained what I'd found and what I'd seen, there was a pause on the line. She needs to come in, he said, or I can come to her. She's just had hip surgery. I'll come to her today, if possible. While I waited for him, I did what any nurse does when a situation needs to be documented. I took photos, the thermostat, the near-empty refrigerator, the medication cabinet above the stove, the note on the counter. I noted the dates and times in the voice memo app on my phone. I wrote down what she'd told me, as close to word for word as I could, with timestamps. Then I drove to the pharmacy and spoke to the pharmacist who had been filling her prescriptions since before I was born. He was a small, careful man who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses he'd had since I was a child. I explained the situation without disclosing more than I needed to. I asked if there was a record of her pickup dates. There was. Her last refill had been the week before Doug left. She would have run out 3 days after he did had she not already picked up a partial earlier in the month. She'd been stretching them. Is that a problem? He asked. For blood thinners, yes, I said. I'll be managing her medications going forward. Can I arrange for blister packs and delivery? Absolutely, he said. And then, quietly over the counter, I've been worried about her. I'm glad you're here. People in small cities know things. They just wait to be asked. When I got back, Mr. Okafor's car was already in the driveway. He was sitting at the kitchen table with my grandmother, drinking the coffee she'd made him, going through papers she'd brought out from the shoebox she kept at the back of her closet. He looked up when I came in, assessed me the way lawyers assess people, and apparently decided I was acceptable because he went straight back to the papers. We spent 3 hours at that table. My grandmother revoked Doug's access to her checking account. She amended her will. She gave me durable power of attorney for both property and personal care. Not because she was incapable, she was sharper than anyone in that room, but because she wanted it documented who she trusted. She also, in clear and precise language, told Mr. Okafor what she wanted to happen to the investment account if she were to pass. 50% to a bursary fund for nursing students at Laurentian University in my grandfather's name. 50% to me. Doug's name appeared nowhere. When the documents were signed and Mr. Okafor had left, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding something heavy for a long time and had just been allowed to set it down. Now we wait, she said. I thought about sending Doug a text. Something urgent. Something to test him the way the story deserved. But I didn't need to bait him. He was coming home in 4 days. He would walk through that door expecting everything to be exactly as he'd left it. I wanted to be here when he did. I spent those 4 days reorganizing her kitchen so everything she needed was reachable. I installed grab bars in the bathroom that her surgeon had recommended 3 months ago and that no one had gotten around to putting up. I set up automatic prescription delivery. I found a PSW, a personal support worker through the Sudbury Home Care Program, a woman named Mrs. Adebayo who came with excellent references and who my grandmother liked immediately. I arranged for Mrs. Adebayo to come 3 mornings a week. I also called my mother. That conversation was harder. My mother lives in Ottawa now. She and Doug have always had the complicated dynamic of siblings who love each other past the point of clear vision. She went quiet when I told her about the note, about the temperature, about the medication situation. He didn't mean to, she started. Mommin, I said, I'm a mandatory reporter. I've already filed a report with the Vulnerable Adults Unit. I'm not asking you to blame him. I'm telling you what happened so you understand what's coming. Another long pause. Then, is she okay? She's okay. She's safe. I'm here. I'm coming up. I know. She drove up the next day. She sat with my grandmother for an hour before she came to find me in the kitchen, and when she did, her eyes were red and her jaw was set. How long has this been happening? She asked. At least since November, possibly longer. She sat down at the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? That was the only question I needed her to ask. The night before Doug was due back, my grandmother and I sat in the living room after dinner. She'd been more herself the last few days. The warmth back in the house, regular meals, her medications on schedule. She'd called 2 friends. She'd laughed at something on the radio. She looked like herself. She reached over and put her hand on mine. You know what your grandfather used to say, she said. I shook my head. He used to say that the people who mistake patience for weakness always get the most surprised. I thought about that for a long time. He was talking about you, wasn't he? I said. She smiled. He was talking about both of us. Doug arrived the next afternoon in good spirits. He pulled into the driveway in the second car, her car, with a duffel bag and a duty-free bag and the specific careless energy of someone who has had a good time and expects to walk back into a life that has been quietly waiting for him. My mother's car was parked on the street. He frowned at it as he came up the walk. I watched him from the kitchen window. He opened the door and called out in his usual way, Loretta, I'm back. I brought you a thing from the mountain. He came into the kitchen and stopped. I was sitting at the table. My mother was standing by the counter with her arms crossed. My grandmother was in her good chair in the living room, visible through the doorway, and she didn't turn around. He looked at me. He looked at my mother. Something shifted in his face, not guilt yet, just recalibration. Hey, he said carefully. I didn't know you 2 were coming. We know, I said. I had prepared the table the same way I'd prepared myself. Not theatrically, just clearly. On the left, my phone, open to the photos, the thermostat, the refrigerator, her medications. On the right, a printed copy of the mandatory report I had filed with Sudbury's Vulnerable Adults Protection Unit. In the center, the note he had left under the sugar bowl. He looked at the table. His eyes moved slowly across it. Doug, my mother said, sit down. He sat. I didn't raise my voice. There wasn't any reason to. I walked him through it the way I would walk a family member through a difficult diagnosis, clearly, precisely, without drama. The temperature in the house when I arrived, the food situation, the medications above the stove, the pharmacy records. What she had told me about November, what she had told me about the other times. He tried the usual defenses. She'd said she was fine. He hadn't thought it would get that cold. He was only gone a week. He'd meant to arrange something. My mother stopped him. She told you to arrange something, she said. Before Christmas, I was on the phone with her when she asked you to look into home care options. I heard you tell her it wasn't necessary. He looked at her. Whatever he'd been prepared to say, that wasn't it. There's more, I said. I slid the copy of the POA consultation letter across the table, the one from the Toronto law firm, the one that had been opened and resealed. He went still. You opened her mail, I said. That was addressed to me. It was addressed to you at this address, I said, which you have been using rent-free for 4 years while accessing her vehicle and her checking account, and while undertaking steps to formalize control over her assets without her knowledge or consent. He opened his mouth. The vulnerable adults report has already been filed, I said. The caseworker is scheduled to visit next week. Mr. Okafor, her lawyer, is already aware of the timeline. My grandmother has made changes to her estate and her accounts that were fully documented and witnessed. None of that can be undone. The color in his face had gone wrong. Not red, pale. The specific pale of someone who has just understood that something they assumed was permanent is not. Loretta, he said, turning toward the living room, appealing to her. She didn't turn around. She can hear you, I said. She chose not to respond. He looked back at me, at my mother, his jaw worked. Where am I supposed to go, he said finally, and the petulance in it was so unmasked that my mother made a quiet sound through her nose. You have 30 days, I said. That's generous, given the circumstances and given what a court might consider about the Aeroplan points. I'd suggest you use the time to make arrangements. He left the table. He went upstairs. We could hear him walking around up there. The sound of drawers and closets, the specific noise of a person recalculating. My grandmother, in her chair, picked up her book. He moved out 3 weeks later. He didn't say goodbye to her. That told me everything I needed to know about whether any of his previous solicitousness had been real. The caseworker came, reviewed the documentation, and opened a formal investigation. I won't say what came of it because it's still in process and because it's not the ending that matters most anyway. What matters is this. 6 weeks after I drove through that blizzard, I drove up again. My grandmother was at the front door when I pulled in, standing in her coat, leaning on her cane, watching for my headlights. The PSW had been coming 3 mornings a week. The grab bars were up. She'd been to 2 dinners at her friend Paulette's house. She'd started doing the crossword again, the paper one. The French one from Le Voyageur that she'd always done and had stopped doing around the time Doug moved in. We went to the Ukrainian place for lunch. The owner called her by her old nickname. She ordered the borscht and the pierogies and ate everything. I had the cabbage rolls because hers are better, and I wanted the comparison to remind me to ask for the recipe again. On the way home, she said, without preamble, "You know what I think about?" "Tell me." "I think about your grandfather buying that account in my name. 1974. He drove me to the credit union, and he said, 'This is yours, it's not mine. Don't ever let anyone tell you it needs to be shared.'" She was quiet for a moment. He knew. He knew the way he knew most things, quietly, ahead of time. He would have liked seeing this week, I said. He would have been very annoyed, she said. He would have handled it much sooner. We both laughed. It felt good. It felt like something returning. I drove home to Thunder Bay the next morning. The Trans-Canada was clear for once. Pale winter sun on the snow, everything flat and white and enormous the way it only is out here. I had the radio on. I had terrible highway coffee. I had about 200 kilometers before the signal went out entirely. I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table, her good chair, her book. I thought about the note under the sugar bowl. Don't make it a thing. I thought, some things you make. Some things you have to make, because if you don't, no one will, and the person waiting alone in the cold will keep waiting. My grandfather was right about patience, but he was also right about the account. About making sure that what belongs to you is clearly, legally, undeniably yours. About making sure the right people know where to find it. The people who mistake patience for weakness always get the most surprised. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and drove north into the white. I still think about that note sometimes. The handwriting, the smiley face at the bottom. There's something particular about the moment when a person's true character reveals itself. Not in how they behave when someone is watching, but in what they leave behind when they walk out the door. Doug didn't think he was doing something monstrous. I genuinely believe that. He thought he was doing the minimum, and that the minimum was enough, because for years it had been. Because my grandmother was patient, and he mistook that patience for permission. That's the thing about people who take without asking. They rely on the decency of others to keep the arrangement invisible. They count on the person being left behind to not make it a thing. What I've learned, what this whole experience carved into me in a way I don't think will ever fully smooth over, is that decency and silence are not the same thing. My grandmother was decent. She was also quiet about what was happening, partly out of loyalty, partly out of that particular stubbornness of people who have survived difficult things and believe they can survive one more. But decency without clarity is just an open door. At some point you have to close it, lock it, and make sure the right name is on the deed. That's the part that stays with me about Mr. Okafor sitting at her kitchen table, his pen moving across those documents. My grandmother wasn't confused or coerced or frightened into those decisions. She was precise. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she had been waiting for the right moment and the right person to make it official. That's not weakness finally correcting itself. That's intelligence that had been biding its time. She had understood the situation clearly long before I did. She had protected herself in the ways available to her, keeping that account quiet, never signing what she hadn't read, holding on to the letter, and when the moment came, she was ready. I think about the strength that takes, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet kind. The kind that gets up every morning in a cold house and takes its medications and waits because it knows that waiting with intention is not the same as giving up. That's what I want to carry forward from all of this, not the confrontation at the kitchen table, though I won't pretend there wasn't something clarifying about watching Doug look at that note he'd left, seeing it through our eyes for the first time. What I want to carry is my grandmother's version of strength. The kind that is rooted in knowing what's right, thinking several steps ahead of the people who underestimate you, and then doing what needs to be done without flinching when the moment finally comes. She taught me that the people who do things right, who actually show up, who make the call, who file the report, who sit on the couch so someone doesn't have to be alone, those people are not naive. They're not pushovers. They're just playing a longer game than the people taking shortcuts around them. And the people taking shortcuts always, eventually, run out of road. I drove north into the white that morning with the radio on and bad coffee going cold in the cup holder, and I thought, I come from her. Whatever I am that's worth anything, I learned it at that kitchen table in Sudbury, from a woman who knew where all the important things were kept, and never once let anyone convince her they weren't hers. That's enough. That's more than enough.